All right, well, thank you for coming. We're going to get right into it. Obviously, this is about AI for branding creative. I'll just frame this conversation by saying, as I mentioned in the video that I'm sure brought a lot of people here, this Draper is coming just from myself over the last 6 months working in AI to something that I've done now for 4.5 years, which is branding and creative production, largely for hotels, but as we'll talk about today, for software, for products as well. And really being astounded by what's been possible, like absolutely blown away. And I think you'll see that today. And just started to share this with people in this past spring. And the response was just incredible, meaning people weren't really aware of what was possible or how to do it. And ultimately, I only started to turn this into Draper, when people started asking for that again and again and again. And we'll get to, at the end of the talk, like what Draper is. Most of this will be about like the meat inside of it. But, this is evolving organically. And I'll just say that. So I'll get right into it. I read everybody's responses to the form I sent out. And I think the, overwhelming consistent experience that people are having with AI is the same one that I had for about a year up until this spring, when I first came across AI 18 months ago, and would pop in and try to make something and just kind of throw something in the prompt in the chat, be disappointed with what I got, and then give up and go back to the old way and circle back a month later and try it again and again and again and again, and never really changed. What changed this spring, though, is learning AI and realizing that, a lot of people responded asking for prompts. They want to know prompts. It's not about prompts. That's frankly not deep enough. With the right foundation, prompts almost become irrelevant. And what I realized and what I mentioned in that video is, if you can work to get to and get clarity on and distill down and translate the emotion, the meaning, the themes, the concept, everything that makes a brand into something that a machine can understand and work with, the prompting becomes so secondary. The speed and the efficiency, 2x's, 3x's, 4x's, versus sitting there looking at a prompt and trying to switch out words, prompt engineering. And this is really what Draper is. It's a system that combines like real human creative in a process with technology to produce the things that we want to produce based off, again, what you all were telling me in that form: compelling brand stories, cohesive brands across touch points, and consistent visuals. We all know you might get a good visual on one prompt. The next is, often left field. How do you tie it all together? It doesn't happen in the prompt box. It happens before that or behind that. And Draper started as a way to systematize the way that I was going about doing that. And the goal with Draper is to take, for anybody, the, raw inspiration, the ideas, the concepts you have in your head, and not only distill them down and bring clarity for yourself, but bring clarity and put it into a format that has taken a lot of experimentation to get very distilled, very concise, into a format that AI can then work with, can then write the prompts for you, can then generate your creative for you. That is Draper. And the outcome of it is not only, just producing a piece of creative like the one you see here on the right. Draper is about building entire worlds. So DealPage is a software I own. Draper did the branding. And not only the branding in I think the most common sense when people think of brand, logo, colors, type, but fleshed out an entire universe, with 2 worlds, not just one, and a story between them, presenting the problem in the old way of doing things in this old world aesthetic, presenting the solution in the new way of doing things in this new era aesthetic, defining not only the guidelines and the specifications in both worlds, but then creating all of the visuals that you're seeing on the screen, the various assets used on social and web, and then ultimately the website as well, the website itself and all the assets within it. And it is only in going back and going through this in one fluid motion and hitting the right points, which I'll talk about on this call, that you can do this, in my opinion and in my experience. And that is what I am working to turn into something that is now Draper. That's something that people can interface with. So on this call, we're going to go through an introduction to me and my background so you guys can understand. You'll see like exactly how this has kind of come to be, the genesis of really the base of the philosophy and the technology, the refinement, and then now the implementation, which is when we'll get a little bit more into Draper itself. So I'll keep the introduction brief. I'm sure a lot of people here know me just from social media. Just quickly though, I studied creative writing, but I started my career in finance. I am a hotel developer and creative director. I'm not trained in any visual medium whatsoever. I do come from a family of creatives, agency owners, advertising agency executives, and I've been around it my whole life. And frankly, always wanted to stay away from it, but have ended up coming back. When I was in high school, this is just a quick backstory. When I was in high school, I built a tiny house in my backyard. When I graduated from high school, I biked from Chicago to LA. That got me obsessed with traveling. I was already obsessed with small spaces, unique spaces. When I graduated college, I bought a camper. I lived out of it and I drove around the West. While I was doing that, I had an idea for a van life campground. Ended up, going to work in finance. I was working on this on the side, left, was doing freelance financial modeling, pitched one of my clients on this concept. Over many years, it evolved and does not represent anything from where it started from, but that was my first concept, Oxydo Sedona. And that was the start of my company, Human Capital, which concepts and capitalizes new projects, focusing on creative direction, brand, digital, all the things we're going to talk about. And since then, I've gotten out of 7 projects, either completed, underway, or in progress, or about to launch. And specifically, what I focus on is trying to grapple with the whole scope of the creative on these projects, whether myself and my team are designing them ourselves or like on the Pearl where we had another design firm, still staying rooted in every single creative like outlet and touch point and trying to keep it all together. Creative direction is the term, but then carrying that all the way through into the actual implementation across all these touch points. So doing that now on multiple projects. And one thing I'll point out before moving on, particularly because as many of you have seen, I've grown my own social and spend a lot of time on it and have learned and experimented with social a lot on the brands that I create. And in the system I created with Draper, social is like a key piece, as if it wasn't obvious, but like social is, in my opinion, the most important medium for a brand today. So not only obsessive on the output, Pearl, like you can see here, getting like consistent series going and making sure our aesthetic is consistent, all the things a good social media team does. I am obsessive about bringing this as early into the process as possible. Something that I experienced when earlier on we hired outside brand companies to come in. We had another company do Hotel Pearl first. Sorry, I got distracted by the hands. I was always frustrated because we would get to color logo type in this PDF and maybe there's a mock-up or two, but how do you then carry this forward? Is it going to work when you carry it forward? For us, it didn't. And so I think a big part in what I wanted to communicate is if, as many of you responded in the forum, you're really focused on social, that is a huge part of how I approach everything and what I tried to do with Draper. All right, now we're going on to Genesis. And like I said, I want to go over this because I think this is important for you all to understand how this developed. And this is where you'll start to see how the AI works. So in these brands, as is the case with many of you, I know from reading these responses, I really like to have like a central story with characters and use that to define the aesthetic. Not necessarily because everybody's going to be able to see through the brand and see that story and that character, if only just to have a uniting lens through which to pass every creative decision to make sure it's all aligning. And then for those consumers who do kind of trickle through and catch that story, it's really special. And on Pearl, that character was Pearlie Thomas, the guy who designed the streetcars that are in front of our building there. And the story was really centered around him. And the way that it came into the brand, or one way that I want to highlight here and how it pertains to Draper, in our website, the reason that we chose a very organized grid-like design system, graphic system, and organization system was because we were pulling from the inspiration of his plans. I found these original plans of his online. And when I went forward into other brands, I wanted to achieve this there as well. Petty Ranch Inn was the project that came after the Hotel Pearl. And we had a good creative foundation, or at least I think so, rooted in research in the market, all the things that, one does, especially if you're a creative on this call, you're probably familiar with. When we got to go to implement and find an art direction to implement in our digital, specifically on our website, the best that we could find to pull together a lot of rich history, a lot of diverse characters, a really rich story, was this idea of communication across time. And I was trying to put this into practice, and I was having a hard time. And somebody told me about Revit, and this truly was the first time. This is when I started using AI. This was about March of this year. This is this blank spot here in my Revit account. This is the first generation I did. Petty Ranch Inn was this past spring. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this call, I got in and I started to create assets, and I was blown away. Realism all the way down to the exact rock formations. And then I would go on to the next asset. It was a little bit hit or miss, but workable. And then I'd go forward and it totally fall off the rails, and I'd lose that consistency. And I think had that experience that many people on this call had, and basically gave up. Got a couple assets out of it, great, but not going to rely on this. What really started to change was I was just not satisfied with this communication across time idea. It felt like to me we were just placing something down on top of this website, where with Pearl, this idea of the engineering documents, the grid-like aesthetic as a way to organize what otherwise is a very playful brand with a lot of handwriting and illustration, that felt much deeper. And I didn't know what was possible with AI and what I'm about to show you, but I just started talking to the AI and explaining like what I just explained to you. Like, hey, this is how I like to do my brands. This was the Hotel Pearl. We had this character. He was an engineer, grid lines in his engineering drawings. I think that would be a good way to organize things. It would contrast the handwriting and the embellishments and sort of like classical embellishments that we were using otherwise. Help me figure out a way, or help me find something, a uniting theme for Petty Ranch Inn. I don't like communication across time. And it just became a conversation and started to explore different ideas. And I brought it up, as I mentioned in that call, to the level of an art director with me. The way in which I did this was not only asking for ideas, asking for help going to explore the visualization of those ideas. So if there was a direction, ranching ledgers in record books, one thing I started to try was like, okay, help me find, what do you mean by that? Show me what you mean. Direct me to the references. Give me Pinterest search terms. Give me brands, comp Instagram accounts where I can see what you're talking about and start to see this come together. From there, I would look at this reference. I would give it the feedback of what I thought was right, what I thought was wrong, what I thought was missing. And it went on and on and on like this. No direction in the conversation. So it ended up taking a long time, days spent on this conversation. But I ended up getting to a point, or gave me this idea of a ranch journal diary. And immediately when I thought of that, I thought of loosely the idea for a family of characters, less of a diary of a single person, more of an archive of this family in this ranch. We named the Petty Ranch Inn after the guy who founded the town, Albert Petty. I started to imagine a family tree of sorts. And in particular, one thing I imagined was like this flat lay website design where there would be for every character a stack of ephemera, of assets, of visuals related to that character and their story. And you would click in and you would get to explore that character's world. This was the idea I had, but I had no idea how to carry it forward. And something that a lot of people said in their form was that they have a lot of new ideas and they don't have a system or process to develop them and define them. That was exactly the point that I was at with this. But I had already gone so far in this conversation. And so I thought, okay, let me just explain that as I just explained it to you all, to the AI. Let's see what it can do, what it can help me with. And it helped me develop the stories, the characters, their names, their eras, their dates, who they were, what they did, the stories in a way that it would align with a specific content pillar of the things that I assumed we would be talking about, such as the rooms in our hotel or the national park that was right next to the hotel, making the characters an architect to speak about the rooms, a national park ranger to talk about the park. And one step at a time started to chip away at that time, what I was guessing at, what I needed to get closer to a point where I could use AI to generate visuals, or I could at least go back to my art director, my graphic designer, and give them the direction to generate those visuals. And what we ended up developing was, I say we, I'm referring to the AI here. It's this family of 6 people. The only one who is a real character is Albert. All of the other characters, their names, their story, their ages, like I said, were made up and fictionalized. And every character was kept tightly aligned with the content pillars that I had assumed and that I set through the process of going through this with the AI. And again, these real references here are pulled with the help and the guidance of the AI, helping me to go find those references. But again, I found myself at this point where it's like, great, okay, now I have this family and it all makes sense, but I can't just take these Pinterest assets and plop them on the website. What really amazed me was going to the next step. And not only, we talk about building out worlds and what makes a consistent and cohesive brand. I think some of those things that are often less talked about are things like image treatments. So the grain, the composition, the style, the tone, the framing. If you can define that, you can create consistency across a brand. And in this brand, I was able to define that, again, with the help of the AI across 6 brands, effectively, 6 characters. And like I said, I'm not trained in any visual medium. These words, these terms, the specifications and guidelines that we came to meant nothing to me before this process. Through this process, I learned them. And I learned that these are the terms, these are the things that get defined, that when I then went to generate the assets and I asked that chat to produce the prompt for me to go generate the assets, these were the words that were getting defined that are based off the era and based off the character. And that's what I mean by backing up, going deep and going through this process first. The prompting becomes secondary. You're not writing the prompts. I got to a point where whatever I needed, I would describe it to this chat that I had been going through and having that chat write the prompts, going to generate the asset, screenshotting the outputs if I liked them or didn't, giving the feedback and going through this cycle again and again. Not only on images, all of these here, by the way, were generated with AI, on graphics as well, and defining in detail for the characters what their graphics would be, the different ephemera, what style they would be in, and how to align it with their era. What was really amazing to me, I had this flat lay idea. Now I've got the specifications and guidelines on these individual assets and the characters. Still, how do I bring this to life? How do I get this website done? It started by generating, this is generated with AI, like a mock-up. But I needed to communicate to my web developer. This is a theme that you'll see in this. I believe AI, more often than not, is best for getting 75 to 80% of the way down the road very, very quickly. And still, in many instances, working with creatives and specialists, but reducing their time and, frankly, their cost substantially and speeding up the entire process. And so that was what I was doing here. And I generated this mock-up, but what was so important about this idea was the concept of how the user would interact with these flat lays and kind of enter into these characters' worlds. And using another tool in Lovable and working with the chat that I still was maintaining in the same way, prompting, reprompting, feedback, iterations, etc., was able to make a technical mock-up, which I'll just show you right here, simply to communicate the function, the navigation, the layout, a little bit more live and something that the designer could grasp better than that singular mock-up image. That has then allowed us to move on to produce probably the website out of all of them I've created that I'm most proud of. And again, carried home with the help, or not the help, with a web designer, but the assets you're seeing on the screen. And then as I've just walked through the entire concept for the website, fleshed out beforehand with the help of AI. and bringing this vision to life. And for this website, generating over 200 individual assets, writing 6,500 words of copy, which if you've done a website, that's a lot. And more important than anything, doing all of this from March 28th was that first generation to hand off on the website on May 7th with everything I just explained, all of the assets, all of the mockups, all of the copywriting. And in this same period of time, doing the same thing in the same process, not only on the Petty Ranch Inn, but on Deal Page, on Petty Cash, another brand, and helping some of my friends, partners, and colleagues with their own brands and iterating and testing this process in this system. So in the span of, 39 days, effectively bringing 5 brands to life, with one of them being the most layered, the most dense brand concept I've ever worked on. And that led to now we'll get into trying to refine this into a system that can be talked about on this call, and that can be something that you all can ideally make use of. And what brought this about was 2 clients of mine on the capital raising side, so helping these developers bring their projects to life by raising capital. One challenge that I've faced again and again on my own projects and with clients is before a capital raise, you're not going to do your branding engagement. Branding engagement, spending 30 grand or $60,000 before you've raised capital just often doesn't make sense. But brand and visuals now more than ever are so important with investors. And I just went to them and I said, hey, this is what I've been doing. Is this something you guys want to work on? I hadn't had it fleshed out yet, but I've just kind of described the process and wanted to take them from, Ukiyo had a concept inspired by the founder's travels in Japan, wanting to create this sort of meditative retreat in North Georgia. And SoVara was a little bit further ahead because they had already built some of, the first initial phase of their project, but still wanted to improve and were already planning on doing a rebrand effectively. And what I had to think about and what the basis of Draper is, there's really 2 parts of it. There's the output that you're trying to get to and the process of getting there. And I spent a ton of time thinking about what is the output, because, and I alluded to this already, it's not just logo, color, type. That's what's left me frustrated in the past. Why I started to work on brands myself to begin with was to make sure that everything was rooted deep in meaning, in story, in something other than, theory or the whim of the graphic designer who's working on the brand. And that those things were not just left at ideas, but were actually carried all the way through, all implementations thought through and created and specified in language in an output that could then be carried forward to handle all production over the life of the brand. I had to start by deciding what were those components that needed to be defined, and then what was the process that's going to get those defined, and how can that be implemented, at least partly, with technology. And I had these documents. These effectively were what I ended up pulling out of that continuous chat that I had going. And by this time, and through all the iteration on Deal Page and those other brands that I mentioned, I had figured out how to get this into a format. And by format, there's a number of things I mean here. Literally the format like you're seeing on the screen, something that can be read by AI, and by AI better, into a format that broke this up between what is most common in language models, separation of instructions and sort of stepwise guidance to the model on how to act, and the basis of knowledge from which to pull from, and what components of a brand need to go where in order to make this most effective. What components of a brand, because you have to hit certain character thresholds or you have limits, what components of a brand can be left out or reduced in length, and what are those things that are most important. That work is a lot of what Draper is today. And that is the product of however many months it's been since March, in iterating and testing and getting it down to that goal output that one needs to get to. This is what you need in order to define all the things that I've been able to define on these brands, so that production can be consistent, so that you can create a cohesive world, and that you can avoid the AI look in the generic assets. This is what's needed. Now, how do you get there? I basically thought about my own creative process really for the first time. It's not often that one steps back, and I'm sure is the case with many here. There's many things you do in your careers and whatever you do that are just second nature based off doing them again and again and again. That was the case for me with creative, but I had to think about, okay, how does AI, well, first, what is the basis of this so that I can figure out how AI fits in? And I ended up spending a lot of time going back with my art director, Julia, my illustrator, Cole, my graphic designer, Michelle, and speaking with them and looking at our past projects and trying to understand what were those steps we took, in what order, what was effective, where did we trip up? Because we've tripped up a lot. Pulling illustrations in too late after the brand is already set. You have too much guidance for the illustration, things like that. And then distilling that down now into the process that informs Draper, which is a process of going, if I had to break it down, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'm actually posting a video about this tomorrow, but it is about pulling out of myself, out of you, out of whoever's doing this, whoever's using Draper, the core raw base information, establishing that at a base level, establishing a creative direction, detailing the way in which I do that, which is a process of what I call framework, where you are limiting down your creative options by setting a frame of constraints that are based on certain territories or categories of research. Each territory or category of research has questions and angles and roads to go down to find both qualitative and quantitative information and visual references that are then used to identify consistencies, patterns, tensions, and juxtapositions, colors, mood, and tone direction, all coming from this frame informed by these sources, these territories. Those key takeaways, the patterns and repetitions becoming themes that define the creative direction, and themes that then define the way that I approach it, what I mentioned earlier about social media and its importance, themes that when paired against what will do well for you on social media, what is doing well in the public domain on social media right now, and finding those topics, those content lanes of a brand early before going into visual identity, so that you can find formats and specific example reference posts and creative assets and collateral, so that you can establish pillars, mock-ups, through which you can pass all of the experimentation that you then do in visual identity. And I think there are people that do it this way. I'm sure there's some on this call. I've never worked with a creative agency that's done this. And this has been probably the most transformative aspect of the process. And it's probably the most important to allow someone like yourself, who may be on this call thinking, this is not me, I'm not Buck, this is not my role. This, and even the framework process above, if I had to describe it, it is verbal output, conversation, exploration, like you probably already do on Pinterest and Instagram, but wherever else, using AI to distill, to identify, to refine, and to define and translate your preferences, your discoveries, the things you find in your exploration into specific guidelines and direction that gets taken forward into the actual production of the brand and then the production of the assets, so that it all stays in line. So a lot of the deeper work on identifying specifics like style, tone, composition, and then carrying those forward into the verbal specification is not done by you. Or that was not the intention, and that was what I was aiming to create, a system in which anyone could walk through this process, and as long as they're willing to discuss, to explore, to pull together and sort of visualize and then discuss further, this process, my process effectively, can be carried through. Now, how is this delivered? What is Draper today? And like I said at the beginning, I'm just going to be transparent. This is, evolving organically. This is not another tool. This is not Midjourney. This is what Draper is. This is what Draper was when I handed it off to SoVara and Ukiyo-e. It was a set of detailed instructions, video and written guidelines detailing everything that I just walked through at a high level, custom GPT trained on everything that I just walked through, trained on the process, and trained to prompt the user and then guide the user on refining its output, on exploration, and on refining and defining that exploration into guidelines, takeaways, and next steps. And it is a template effectively for taking those final outputs, that final language, so that then becomes the document I referenced earlier, the format I referenced earlier, something that is then defined so it can be retained by AI and used to create any creative production need in the future. Copywriting for a website, an investment deck, social media posts, visual assets, etc. That is what Draper is at this stage. And when I started working with Ukiyo and SoVara, I want to walk through, really what I want to show is what this looks like in practice. And in particular, probably the most important part, I'll get to Draper at the end of this, how it's packaged, how people interface with it. The way I worked with Ukiyo and SoVara was effectively collaborative. You know, this is what was handed off. They led it, they drove. And at the time, I had not identified what these checkpoints were, but they emerged organically. When a hurdle was hit, when there was confusion, when a checkpoint just was felt to be needed, either by them or when I checked in with them, I thought I could add value. We checked in, we had a call, and frankly, live on the call did work together, whether that was exploratory, verbal and qualitative, or visual producing and tweaking assets and trying to find those specifications on the brand, and then carried forward into the final production, producing together, especially so that before our engagement was done, we could go back, loop back, and update that, what I call the creative base here, so that they were set and ready to carry forward into the future. So I'll give an example on Ukiyo. I showed earlier in the process, Ukiyo's inspiration coming from a trip to Japan. You know, many people here, I'm sure, have concepts, and I'm sure we're inspired by similar things, experiences that you had. And I got Ukiyo, Brian, started on this process. And at our first checkpoint, one thing that was very clear to me was that where he was landing was very Japanese, for lack of a better term. And what I felt like was missing was rootedness in the place, you know, especially in hotels and real estate. The destination where you are is so important, unlike, you know, a software or a product. And in discussing with him live on a call and explaining what I thought was missing and why I thought it was important, him agreeing to at least explore it, and then going to pull from those sources more references and more ideas into the frame and looking at them together. A couple things that we identified was the prominence and importance of trees, of the plant life in his area and on his property, and an importance that we thought to educate on Japan and culture and traditions and the things that he experienced, rather than trying to mimic or trying to create Japan or a Japanese experience in the North Georgia mountains. And these were things that came out of conversation together live on a call. This is an example specifically of like one of those checkpoints and how it works, that then were carried forward into the themes that we set, which became very important, as I think you'll see, into the actual brand that was produced and the creative that was produced. Pulling the tree theme, these peaks that are seen from his property, tying Georgia in with this Japanese inspiration by presenting subject matter that is local, that is rooted in place in a Japanese aesthetic, was how we determined to tie those things together. And the idea of education, setting really the tone for the graphic styles, the typefaces or the typography system that we ended up establishing. This was then carried forward into initial website exploration, into final social assets. And then importantly, the outcome for Brian, where he's at in the capital raising journey, was getting him ready to launch his pre-sale, his pre-launch sale, to generate sales for his property before going to raise money from investors. All of this done in a matter of weeks. All of this done live and collaboratively. All of this done without, you know, a 3-week gap between PDF submittals with different color system and typographic systems from a graphic designer. That was a special process. And I realized there's something here with Draper, and especially in this collaborative approach, that I don't yet know how is fully replaced by just technology. I'll give an example now with SoVara. Like I said, SoVara was a little bit further along, but they still were coming at it with as fresh of a mindset as Ukiyo as I did on my brands. And as they did their first run at it, which is essentially that process of going from the GPT to exploration, defining, locking in those final outputs, and then generating and starting to generate assets, starting to generate color palettes based off of this. One thing that I felt when we got on the call was that based off what I knew they wanted their brand to be from what they had told me, I felt like this was just simply too masculine. And I felt like there was something needed to soften it. And actually, really what came back after that first go was this. I felt like it was way too masculine. This is where we ended up going. This is what started to get produced once we focused in again on place. We started to talk about things through questioning simply on the call. What are the colors and tones that are going to be on your property? What plants are you planting? That led us to lavender, which led us to then explore, well, first blues from the mountains and then purples to set the color tone, which ended up setting really the vibe of the entire brand, something a lot more feminine, something a lot more whimsical than what they had before, which was much sharper. This has not only allowed SoVara to set this brand, but got them ready to launch their capital raise, which they just launched today, to create the assets that were a part of the capital raise and the materials that they created. And again, all in a matter of weeks, without the standard lag times and delays that come from a process with a traditional branding agency. So these are just two examples. And like I said at the beginning of this call, and I mentioned just a few moments ago, the purpose of this call for me was to, as I've done in the talks with groups like Hampton and other places that inspired me to pull this together and to start putting it out there, was to first just show what was possible with AI, what can be produced, to describe how I've gone about doing that. And I wanted to do that through a story of progression and how it's evolved over time and how I move from one step to the next, so that at the very least, a takeaway could be for yourself to go through that exploration yourself and understand that if you do the steps that I vaguely described in this call, or even something akin, but you focus on exploring, refining and defining, and most importantly, keeping the creative exploration, the themes, the emotion, the human element retained somewhere, ideally in a chat-based language model like a ChatGPT or a Claude, and you focus on that rather than the prompts and the image generation tools, you will be more effective. You can have your prompts be generated for any tool you want to use, and it'll be more effective than what you may be doing now, which is trying to fine tune and engineer the prompts. As far as Draper and what it is and how it works, besides what I've just explained, where I'm at right now in pulling it actually together, giving it a name, making videos about it on social media, I am wanting to carry it forward into something, into a business, into something that people can use. And I have, candidly, ideas on how it could be packaged. Like I said, early in the process of systematizing the branding process and codifying what that output needs to be, I thought, great, I'm making so much headway in like turning this very ephemeral, creative idea and process into something, codified and technical. This could be a product. But like I said, in working with Ukiyo and SoVara, I think if it were a product, even with guidance, I think a lot might be lost. But that might be right for some people. And that might make this something that's more approachable to more people. I think the collaborative approach is very, very powerful. It puts the power in the user's hand. It allows for education. I know one thing that was important to both Ukiyo and SoVara was going through this themselves so that they could do it themselves or train the team themselves going forward. It maximizes the impact of myself and my team by focusing in on those key points where directions and angles and ideas can be found that can alter the trajectory. of a brand and of creative. And it ends up with that base, that important, critical, creative base that then empowers the team or that person going forward. And then, of course, there's the approach of an agency, which some of my projects are my own and some are my clients. So effectively, that's what I've done for many years now. And just doing an agency approach now, using AI to move faster, to bring the client into the process more, to the extent the client is willing and interested, allow them to do some of the exploration or some of the process, such as just on colors or just on type, but driving largely the process with our team, with my team. Those are the ways in which I think this gets packaged. This is the background and the process that created this and how it's currently set up. I plan on doing more of these workshops, and in future workshops with my team that I have working on Draper, starting to go into individual technical aspects, such as ChatGPT projects versus ChatGPT custom GPT. How are those built? How do you use them? And to some extent, going into the creative. I think there's an element of this that doesn't get shared, that is a part of Draper and is a part of the process for the people that work with us in any capacity. I right now am focused on and very interested in getting more people in that collaborative approach and working very closely with people. And frankly, only taking on a small number of groups so that it can remain very focused and this can continue to be built out. And I know there's some people here that maybe that's not where they're at, and they're more interested in something like people said in the forums, like a course or just like the tools, the prompts. I think that will come, but that's what I'm looking for right now. And I want to have conversations with people. I have opened up a number of slots on my calendar the next 2 days. And I have a link that I'm going to send around after this call. And if you're interested in doing this, in getting to a brand like the ones that I've shown, in setting a creative base, in learning AI and learning this process, and then being able to produce AI going forward, then I'd like you to fill out that form. And I'd love to talk to you about your brand and whatever you're working on and explore potentially working together. If that's not you, still fill out the form. I think there's some questions in there that I put to get an understanding deeper than the type form I already sent around on what people are looking for, so that, for example, in some sort of course or tool, it can be more accurately developed for the use cases that people are looking for. I'd like to open it up to questions if people have any, and really let it rip on anything you have on your mind, and I'll do my best to answer them to the extent I can on this call. Otherwise, yeah, we'll leave it there, and I'll shoot this link around. Actually, don't know how these. Oh, here we go. All right. Christian asked, this is important for a boutique hotel, the storytelling, the deep brand building, but what about all industries, manufacturing, blinds, drapery? Does this marketing strategy apply? Are there ways to do it simpler? I think any brand in any industry would only be enhanced by going to this level of depth. The creative output might be different, but the process is about getting an understanding of your customers, what resonates with them on an emotional level, and how that can be conveyed through visuals across all touch points so that your marketing can be more effective. I think that applies to any industry. There's a number of tools for websites: Lovable, V0, Figma, and Webflow. And it's a combination. It depends on the website and the project, whether I'm going to try to carry it all the way through in one of those AI builders, or if it's about getting to a certain point and handing it off. Yeah, so there are so many tools out there. How do you arrive at the tools that have been the most effective? Doing this every single day and working with my team and working with our clients and experimenting and noting. I was just talking to someone about this today. Every week, tools are leapfrogging each other, not overall, on singular features and use cases. Reve, I hardly use, but it's great for slide decks. That's the one thing it's good at. And really keeping a catalog of those tools or use cases. And then a part of Draper too that I didn't mention. Well, I did. I said Draper that GPT is trained. What it's trained on is how to prompt you most effectively, the creative system, my creative philosophy, and how to distill and refine, how to guide you on exploration on things like Pinterest search terms, how to identify comps, pull in their links to their websites and their Instagram so that you can explore. And then very importantly, trained on prompting on all the key platforms and the specific platforms for the specific use cases at each step in the process. That's continually evolving, like I said. I look at Draper as like the art director base where you're collaborating, but you're also getting direction on what tools to use and how to use them. Still not clear on going from foundation to artifacts. Do you just share your insights from your chat on foundations? By artifacts, what do you mean by artifacts? Like Claude artifacts? If you're referring to the like creative base or creative foundation, I'm still thinking of a better name. So if anyone has any ideas, but it's effectively a brand guideline, but much deeper, human language, some specifics and guidelines that you see in a brand guideline, but a lot deeper and a lot more broad. How do you go? I mean, that is the system. That's what I described doing and spending the last several months on, is figuring out how to do that. I think, and I've seen, and I saw it early in my process without any structure or guidance, simply putting the output or a distillation and summary of the output that I arrived at through the chat that I was working in into that backend was effective. Draper, besides the like training on the direction and the prompting and the exploration, the key value is how is that pulled out of you, pulled out of the, the creative universe of possibilities, and then how is that defined, captured, stored so that it can be used going forward. Okay, and then how is that used to go to assets, visual assets, and graphics? That base that comes from the process that is walked through, that is what informs every prompt that is written. That is what informs the direction on what tool to use, when, what feature to use. The prompts are written by that model, trained on that brand and that base. The information in that base optimized for that specific purpose, largely for prompting, but it's also a document that can be handed to a graphic designer and be understood just as easily. And frankly, when shared with my graphic designers, they thought it was better than any other piece of like collateral or base collateral that they've worked from. I'm going to put the form in the chat here, and then I'll also send it out. Yeah, someone asked about the cost savings from using this AI stack. I mean, the cost of the subscriptions to the tools is negligible. I, like many on this call, I'm sure, am subscribed to way more than I should be. But I look at it in the hundreds of dollars compared to the tens of thousands of dollars. So yeah, I think it's meaningful. All right, I think I sent can you guys see the link to the form that I just sent? I'm not sending out that deck. It wasn't a deck, it was a fig jam. So number one, not a shareable. Number two, just don't feel comfortable doing that, but I'll share the recording with everybody who was on this call and everybody who filled out the type form who wasn't on this call. Where do I go for information on AI? I have someone on my team, or I'm working with someone closely that is an expert on that and stays up to date. I read largely on Twitter and sometimes in the news, just when scrolling the news. Yeah, so someone asked, how are you consolidating the information into a more stable format? Again, I could not put a number. I mean, dozens and dozens of iterations of a final creative base output that covered all the information I wanted it to cover while still being powerful enough and robust enough to drive the production I wanted it to drive. And then putting it in a format and breaking it up between the knowledge base, the instructions, which have different limits on how much context can be stored. That is the one of the key parts of the core of this. So that is what working with Draper achieves. It would be far too much to cover to explain how that's done on the call. Oh, you guys can't see the link? 1 second, I'm resending it. So I actually have I have Michael Grova from SoVara on the call here. Michael, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here.
So this is Michael from SoVara, the brand that I just referred to and who walked through this process and was one of the first to use Draper. If anyone has questions for Michael, let it rip. I thought it would be helpful to hear from the mouth of the babe, so to speak. Don't be embarrassed. Let it rip.
Maybe while we wait, Buck, I can try to identify with everybody for a second. But first of all, I'm not paid to be here, just a client, and happy to share the journey. So we followed, like probably many of you, followed Buck's journey on social, admired the work that was being done and the openness to the process. We were already several years into a 6-cabin development, also just by coincidence in North Georgia, as Ukiyo-e, one of his other clients. And, I think that if I were to sum it in one sentence in terms of what we were struggling with, was we were already deep into the build, had raised capital in many different ways from banks, private investors, and equity investors, debt and equity and all those things in various forms. But I don't believe that even though we were able to do that, we did not have a very strong brand identity. And although as a designer myself, we had a strong aesthetic, we didn't have truly that deep identity that Buck was discussing with, Petty Ranch and other brands, Hotel Pearl and others, that carried through all of our visual assets. In fact, our visual assets were pretty non-existent. And although the concept was strong in our heads and whatnot, we couldn't articulate that into the world, or I was unable to do that. And Draper gave us a system whereby, I'm very hands-on, we can work together and get in that process, learn the process of building that identity, how to carry it all the way from a font system to a color system, but really maybe even more importantly, to an identity that then informed and could inform everything that we do, and ultimately how we interact for us as a hospitality brand with our guests and the people that are coming to stay. In fact, we were able to develop many additional layers that we hadn't conceived of that told a story, not just that we were trying to sell with our properties, but of the community and the history of the community. And through Draper, we were able to bring that all together and ultimately offer what we hope is a much deeper, richer, both experience on site, but also identity for the brand.
So, Michael, can you turn on your camera now, actually? And somebody asked you a question. Haley said, maybe you can't see it. She said, can you share a bit on your existing creative background and how advanced was this process? Is it approachable for someone who is not a technical creative?
Yeah. So although I have a design background, I, like Buck, I'm not trained necessarily. I became a designer just through trial and error, just like I've become a developer through trial and error, make a lot of mistakes, and I'm willing to make mistakes. But specifically, the process of utilizing Draper, which was really the process, not to make it, it's a process of talking through your ideas and then allowing the AI to help you formulate the brand and the identity through listening to yourself, if you will, articulate what you want, what you aspire to, what your dreams are. I don't know if I answer the question directly, but I'm happy to give it another shot. Were there other layers to that question?
What about, Michael, on, articulating and discussing what your dreams are?
Yeah.
So that's you sort of instigating. What did you feel like the GPT prompted you to do? Or is there anything you were surprised where maybe it asked you a question or told you to do something and you were like, oh, wow, I never would have thought of that. That's really helpful.
Yeah. I think, in our case, just, to give the frame of reference, as a developer, and this I believe it was Christian's earlier question, maybe, about would it work for non-hospitality brands? Absolutely. It's just giving any company an identity and helping you walk through that from kind of start to finish. But for us specifically, I was so wrapped up in the build and the challenges of the build, and it's a multi-million-dollar project, and there are many layers and many challenges, that there were so many questions, Buck, to answer your question, that I hadn't thought of all of them. So in fact, the questioning and the answering, the back and forth, and then the layering of that was where there was a huge amount of value. And yeah, we were able to go in lots of different directions through a process, though, that we were walking through the process. And as you mentioned, there were a couple of times along the way where I'm like, I'm not sure where I'm going here. And we got together, and also with the GPT, we're able to kind of redirect, and you were able to keep us in the bumper cars so that we went in the right direction and kind of got through that to the next layer and the layer and the layer. So, and it's still a process. I'll be, also totally transparent. We're still developing this. We will continue to develop this. Our hospitality brand is brand new, and we're finding ways to interact with our guests and offer a deeper and deeper experience, and utilizing AI with our visuals and our storytelling and the continued depth of the brand as we move forward. And Draper continues to be a part of that process, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Any other questions? I'm just responding to one in the private chat that was specific. Otherwise, we can call it a night. I appreciate everybody who joined. I'll give it one last go. Nope, all good. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'll send out an email with that type form. Bye-bye.